Well, if the governor and the legislature get in a pickle, they can go into those funds. There's 1,200 of those little funds all around state government. They can go and sweep money out of those funds that haven't been spent yet, transfer it into the general fund to make the general fund look more balanced than it really is. And they did that for $300 million. Then they did an accounting maneuver called the K-12 rollover for $300 million. The money that goes out to the K-12 school districts essentially goes out in a monthly payment. Think of it as 12 payments, and the last payment, the 12th payment each year, is the June 15th payment. Well, the state uses a cash accounting system, which means it only recognizes an expense if it actually writes the check during that month or that year. Well, instead of sending the payment out on June the 15th, if you wait 16 days and send it out on July the 1st, it looks like you didn't have a June 15th payment. But now how many do you have next year? Now you've got 13 payments in the next year. And it's called the K-12 rollover because as soon as you start playing that trick, you almost always have to roll the last payment of that year into the next year, because if you couldn't afford 12 payments this year, how are you going to afford 13 next year? But in the first year you do it, you save a payment on paper because you didn't have to write the check during June. And then they decided we better cut the spending. 10.6 was a little too much. We'll cut the spending by $100 million. They got it to 10.5. That's the 10.5 that's in the yellow boxes right here in the general fund. However, by the time they counted the money that had really come in for the 08 budget, it hadn't slipped to 9.1, it had slipped to 8.8. But somehow they determined that, or hoped that the recession was over, that things were going to get better in 09 because they projected revenue would grow to 9.1. That's when they also added the photo radar. That was going to collect $120 million or something.
Netflix makes a lot off that.
Yeah. So they thought or hoped that the revenue would grow to 9.1. But they set the spending thing. They set the spending at 11.1.
That doesn't make sense. Got that credit card out.
Yeah. So there was a $2 billion shortfall right there. And how did they make it look like it was balanced? Well, they took another $100 million out of the rainy day fund. They borrowed $525 million by selling some bonds over at the School Facilities Board and transferring the money over to the general fund so that it will all be spent that year in the general fund, even though the bonds will have to be paid back plus interest over the next 20 years. They did another $325 million of the fund sweeps that hadn't been spent on whatever they were supposed to be spent on. Yeah, airport money, all kinds of underground storage tanks, 911 emergency phone system funds. They did another month of the K-12 rollover. So now they're not only shifting June's payment into July of the next year, they're shifting May and June's payment into July of the next year. They shifted $100 million over of money that was supposed to be spent on highway maintenance to pay for the Department of Public Safety. And then they said, ooh, we better cut the spending a little bit. They cut the spending from 11.1 back to about 10.7. However, as we now know, the economy did not bottom out in 08 and get better in 09. It continued to slip. As of January of last year, it was coming in at about $8 billion a year. By the time they actually counted it at the end of June, it had slipped to 7.
Okay, let me ask you a question.
Yes.
On the borrowing, was that sufficient to get around a constitutional restriction, or just nobody decided to challenge it?
Nobody decided to challenge it.
They'd have lost, I think, the way I understand the Constitution.
Constitution, yes, has a debt limit of $350,000.
Right.
I know. I was state treasurer for a long time. You know?
And yet, by calling it different things, or by not, on the surface, calling it a general fund obligation.
And nobody challenged him on it.
Right,
You couldn't get away if you were a business owner.
right. right.
You'd be in the big house.
Yeah, and especially with some of these other little things they were doing. So that's the $3 or more billion-dollar problem that Governor Brewer and the new legislature inherited last January, February. They took the last $100 million out of the rainy day fund, so that's been wiped out. They used all the remaining cash balance. They started using money from the federal stimulus funds. Used about $500 million in this year. And they started delaying some other payments to other state agencies, or called the rollovers. And then they did cut the spending. They cut the spending back to about $10 billion from the 10.7. Now, where would you cut $600 or $700 million of spending out of just the yellow? Well, you got to cut, and everything was cut across the board, but you got to cut some bigger chunks out of the big three stacks there. Education took a cut of about $132 million that year. Now, $132 million is a lot of money, and no one, Republican, Democrat, Independent, whatever, wanted to cut education. But out of a system that has $11 billion total, $132 million is 1%. Now, it probably felt like twice that because they got the cut in early February and only had till June to absorb the cut. But we're talking maybe 2 or 3 or 4% cuts, not a 20 or 30 or 40% cut. Health and welfare took a cut of $130 million out of $10 billion total, 1.3%. So we're not talking 20, 30, 40% cuts. And then they went to work on the 2010 budget. Again, hoped that the recession had hit the bottom and things would be better. They projected revenues of 7.1, up from 7, but they only were able to cut the spending to 9.9. So they started off day one with a $2.8 billion imbalance. They really started using large amounts of federal stimulus money, $1.3 billion in this. They swept $425 million from the other little funds that are supposed to be spent on other things. Now they're sweeping money that's not supposed to be used on a boat ramp in a couple of years. They're sweeping money that some state agencies needed to operate next month, which is why 8 of the state agencies sued the legislature and all won to get their funds back. Because when the chiropractors or the dentists around the state all pay $200 or whatever they pay to the chiropractor or the dental board, they expect that that money will be used to run the chiropractor board or the dental board, not swept into the general fund and used on whatever else. There was a property tax that was allowed to increase, statewide property tax that had been set at 0 many years before. You may have heard that the state sold Capitol buildings and some other state buildings for $700 million, and we're now renting those back from the investment group at the bottom. So we're renting our state capitol. And then they did about $300 million of cuts, so they got the spending back to about $9.6 billion. But the economy didn't get better. As of right now, we're on a pace to collect about $6.2 billion, and 9.6 is going out the door. They decided, or there's talk of, maybe doing another $450 million of the delayed payments, the rollover payments to the various state agencies. There's talk of maybe borrowing $750 million more. The biggest chunk of this would come by borrowing $450 million from some banks and pledging the next 10 years of all the lottery ticket sales to pay it off. And then on May the 18th, we're going to have a special statewide election as to whether or not to raise the sales tax by 1% per dollar, which would generate about $900 million. And that's the state budget. They have, just about 3 weeks ago, cut the spending back to about 8.9. So they've got the spending back to about 8.9, but you only have 6.2 or so coming in the door.
And to hear the screaming, you'd think they'd cut it back to 0.
Right.
You know, because people.
Now, what's the long-term solution?
That's what I wanna know. What do you propose that they
Okay.
do?
The long-term, well, it's